Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to XpoNorth Day 2 in the afternoon. I'm Joan Johnston, Fashion, Craft and Textiles Advisor for XpoNorth. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, we support the creative sector of the Highlands and Islands region. This includes creative disciplines of writing, publishing, screen and broadcast, heritage, digital and technology, and music, fashion, craft and textiles. So today I am delighted to have Patrick Grant as our keynote speaker, who will be talking very soon. Just before we start, I'm going to give you a little bit of background for those that know Patrick. He's a very broad portfolio, obviously more recently recognised in his role as the judge in the Great British Sewing Bee, and the final was last night, so very exciting times. Will not spoil who the winner was, but obviously it's great to see that certainly there was a Scottish influence in there. So anyway, Patrick has been involved in lots of television documentaries around manufacturing and is passionate about UK manufacture, which is a subject close to my own heart, having been in the UK textile manufacturing industry for many years. I'm not going to say too much more, but obviously we're delighted to have Patrick on board today, and Patrick is now going to share with us how he sees the reshaping of the textile industry for the 21st century and beyond. So welcome, Patrick. I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you. Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining, whether you're joining, whichever way you're joining, whether you're joining direct or via the Facebook link. Hello, one and all. Yes, exciting day for me. We had the final of Great British Sewing Bee last night, so delighted to see how well received that was. I won't give you any spoilers either, just in case you haven't watched it and you want to. You can actually go back and watch all 7 series on the iPlayer now. So if you're really, really bored, have a crack at that. It's about 500 hours of competitive sewing for you. As Joan says, I've had a fairly varied career in clothing and textiles. I began my career about 16 years ago when I took over at the bespoke tailors Norton & Sons, which is a small bespoke tailors, 200 years old this year. And straight out of doing a master's degree, I somehow came across by complete chance a little advert in the back of the newspaper that said that Norton & Sons was for sale. So I took the business over, and that was where I got started. But I had a long family connection with the textile industry. My grandfather was a yarn designer. He worked for a firm called Laidlaw and Fairgreaves, based in Selkirk. I think that's right. And was involved in the broader textile industry for many, many years, and then became the officer for regeneration of the Borders industrial region on the back of some of the decline in the textile industry. So a long association with that region and with textiles. And personally, you know, I spend a lot of time visiting places like the Isle of Harris on holiday, where of course I'm very closely associated with the textile industry there. But I went from running Norton & Sons to restarting another old clothing business called E.Tautz, which we restarted in 2009. And again, that was an old brand that had been part of the Norton & Sons family, and we restarted it with the basic idea that we would try and make everything we could in the UK. So we went and collected. We went and collected a fantastic assortment of textile manufacturers and garment manufacturers to make product for us. On the back of that, I was invited by Debenhams to join them and produce a collection for them. So I restarted a brand called Hammond & Co., which was a long-standing sporting tailors, a bit like E.Tautz, but a little bit older. And having made a success of that brand, about 6 years ago, I got a message from one of our manufacturers, one of the makers for E.Tautz, a clothing company in Blackburn called Cookson and Clegg. And their CEO wrote to me on a Sunday and said, you know, unfortunately, they would be closing the business. And we, you know, after a very brief discussion and some quick toing and froing, we took over that business. So we became a manufacturer of clothes as well as a designer and retailer of clothes and a bespoke tailor and a designer of high street clothes via Debenhams, and all of those interesting, I think I sit in a fairly interesting position amongst clothing designers, because I wear all of these different hats. And so it was at that point in time that I started to think about how we might need to change the textile industry here to make sure that it was firstly fit for purpose for the 21st century and beyond, but also to try and save what was there and rebuild what was there, knowing that changes needed to happen. So when I took over Cookson and Clegg, they were losing an awful lot of money, and they were suffering many of the same problems that lots of other businesses in the UK textile and garment manufacturing industry were facing. So I put my thinking cap on and started to think about how the clothing industry could be changed and what it needed to do for the better. And out of all of that thinking came the idea for a business called Community Clothing, which I started 5 years ago now. So what I thought I'd talk to you about today, so this is me, I wear lots of different hats in the clothing industry. And prior to the pandemic, we had a portfolio of 5 businesses, all of which were doing slightly different things in slightly different ways. But I thought I would talk to you today about how the clothing industry has evolved over time, and where, in my mind, I think it ought to be migrating to in the future, in order to make sure that it does right by consumers, it does right by the people who make the product, and it does right by the planet, which are all 3 of which are very important stakeholders in our industry. So I do a version of this talk reasonably often, and I always start by asking a very similar question, and that question is, how do we all feel about the clothes we're wearing today? How many of us know exactly where they come from? How many of us know exactly what they're made from? And how many of us feel absolutely happy that everything that's happening in that clothing ecosystem is good for us, good for the planet, and good for everybody else? So if I could see you all, and if I was standing in the room with you, I'd ask you to put your hands up and tell me how many of you are completely happy with it. I don't know, maybe you can do a virtual stick your hand up if you think that everything you're wearing is really good for the planet and good for workers and good for us. Typically the number of people who say yes is really pretty small. But that is a fairly interesting and recent development, because until not that long ago, actually the textile industry was really pretty good. It was pretty good for everyone. And much like all the other things that we buy in this country, up until quite recently, it was all made pretty locally. It was all made out of good stuff. It was all made to last. And the work that was created in making all of this stuff actually had a very positive influence on society, and created a lot of economic benefit for lots of people and lots of towns and lots of regions, and all of that has changed quite recently. I mean, we started with this idea some time ago. I mean, Adam Smith came up with the idea that really consumption was a good thing, and everybody bought into that idea. And so for quite a long period of time, we followed this idea that greater consumption means greater benefit for mankind. And actually, I think nowadays a lot of people are challenging that view. So I thought, if I go through how the textile industry evolved, I think it helps to understand where it is now, and it helps us also to understand where it might go to in the future. So if we go back to the very beginning, and by the very beginning, I'm talking about the kind of Stone Age and before. Human beings walked around naked. I mean, we're talking about 35,000 years ago or something in that order. human beings were naked, and those of us that lived in the colder parts of the world, I guess at some stage realized that being cold was a bit boring, and the animals that we'd just eaten had nice furry skin, and maybe we could chop some of that up and turn it into something useful for us to keep ourselves warm. And at some point, somebody clever whittled a needle out of a piece of bone and took some gut or some sinew out of something that he just had for his lunch, he or she had just had for their lunch. And the first bits of clothing were created. And obviously at this point in time, I mean, it's a fairly daft thing to say, but obviously at this point in time, every piece of clothing was made out of something completely natural. It was all made out of stuff that was available around about where we were. And every piece of clothing was cherished and repaired. I mean, you didn't want to go through this process twice. So, that fur cape or the fur booties that we made ourselves to keep ourselves warm were absolutely cherished. Fast forward about 33,000 years, and we get to the period around about the era when the Egyptians kind of ruled the world, or the Romans ruled the world, and we have made incredible advances in the technology of the textiles and the clothing that we wear. So by this point, we've invented spinning, we've invented weaving, we've invented dyeing, we have invented some basic bits of clothing that we all wear, and that technology makes the clothes we wear much better. They're more comfortable. They are more durable. They're more colourful. But of course, they're still made at this point using entirely human-powered bits of machinery. So the loom and the spinning wheel or the spindle. We're plant dyeing in earthenware pots in a very small scale, and of course we are at this stage still using materials that are completely natural and pretty much local to us. So in certain parts of the world we were using cotton, in other parts of the world we were using linen and wool and other animal fibers, and some other plant fibers as well, like hemp and jute we use for other bits of the process. So of course it's still very natural and very environmentally friendly, and of course everybody still cherishes their clothing, and those people that own clothing tend to keep it for a very long time, and so everything is still good. Fast forward again another 1500 years or so to the advanced Middle Ages, and we now all of a sudden have a series of industries springing up in a modern sense. So the birth of the idea of capitalism happens around about this time. The birth of things like the limited company happened around about this time. You have a merchant class that all of a sudden realizes that if you can organize the production of textiles and organize the production of clothing, you can make a bit of a profit out of it. And so we start to see specialized merchants dealing in clothing. We see specialized retailers. We have specialized tailors and seamstresses dedicated to making clothes. And the merchants finance all of this production in a way that starts to begin to look a bit more like an industry that we have today. Then various other things started to happen. I mean, we have a very significant industrial revolution, which begins at the sort of early part of the 18th century. And by the 1850s, we've been through this enormous transformation here in the UK. Huge numbers of people have left agricultural jobs and come to cities to work in factories. Factories themselves are invented. The idea of a factory is invented. Mechanized spinning, mechanized weaving, advances in dyeing technology. The sewing machine is invented, and the production of clothing becomes much more efficient, so it becomes much more affordable to ordinary people to buy new clothes. But also the quality of the clothes increases really dramatically. So the quality of cloth increases very sharply, and also the quality of construction of clothing increases. But it's still seen as something that is, clothes are things that people, again, continue to cherish. They keep them for a very long time, and they're not cheap by any stretch of the imagination. They're still expensive items. But around about this time, we also see the birth of something new, which is the idea of fashion. We start to see fashion magazines appear around about this time, and the idea that people would change their clothes in order to keep up with some sort of notional idea that the clothing they're wearing is fashionable is something that was born around about that time. Also, the idea of shopping happens around this time too. We have the rise of the department store. People like Selfridges and Debenhams appeared around about this time, and shopping as a pastime, as something that we do just really for fun, is something that happens then. So up until this point in time, we hadn't thought of going to shops just to pass some time. The idea of consumption just for fun was a relatively late innovation, and of course it was the start of something that progressed right up until this day. But at the same time, there was some quite serious things happening, and whilst there were some positive benefits of the Industrial Revolution, there was an awful lot of negative too. Many of the employers were pretty awful. Huge numbers of workers were being exploited. There was an incredible amount of pollution being created by the industry that made the things that we all need. And as consumers, we decided that this was a bad thing. There was outcry at the conditions under which people making the things we bought were being forced to work, and lots of very progressive labor laws were enacted in this country that outlawed all sorts of stuff that was going on. So there were minimum wages maximum number of hours of work were put in place. A minimum age for workers was put in place. Factory conditions were the health and the sanitary conditions within factories were improved dramatically. Paid holidays, all sorts of stuff that we sort of take for granted in this country were enacted around about this time, because as consumers we thought it was terrible that the people that made our stuff were being treated in this way, and also we were all disgusted by the state of the air and the state of the water that we all had to breathe and use in our daily lives, because industry was creating all of this foul pollution. So hold on to that thought, because where has all of this taken us right up until this moment today? So there were lots of changes that were instituted, and they were good changes, and lots of labour laws were enacted about that time. Not all manufacturers were bad. There were some very enlightened manufacturers, including people like Robert Owen, who built or extended New Lanark. Some very forward-looking employers realized that happy employees were productive employees, and so they built fantastic kind of utopian communities around their production facilities. So they would not only build a factory, but they would build high-quality housing for their staff. They would they'd provide them with schools and hospitals and libraries and theatres and swimming pools and sports facilities and cooperative stores and all sorts of other amenities that made the life of their workers so much more pleasant. And in return, they found that productivity in those factories went up. So, when we look at people like, like Google and their bean bags and football tables and free vending machines, this is nothing new. Enlightened employers in the middle of the 19th century were already doing this in a way that was actually in many ways much more meaningful. Through all of this, we start to see quite significant changes in the way we think about clothes and we think about production, and much of it was positive. Okay, so now we'll fast forward another chunk of years right through to the 1970s. And by the 1970s, we've seen another enormous change in the shape of the textile industry. Firstly, couple of very significant changes to the structure of the industry. Whereas before this time, most of the textiles and the clothing produced in this country were produced by a series of small independent producers. So most mills were owned by owners who lived in the town in which the mill was sited. Their children went to school with the children of the mill workers. The money that they earned, the profits that were earned from those businesses were mostly spent within the local economy. Any big surplus quite often found its way back into the local community because, mill owners would pay for civic buildings, they'd pay for hospitals and technical colleges and other civic projects, including parks and all sorts of other things that positively enhanced the community. And they also felt a real connection to the community, and they understood the value of their manufacturing businesses and understood the value of the jobs and the sense of identity that all that work created for the people that lived in those towns, and obviously the people that worked for those businesses. And by the 1970s, all of that had really started to move quite dramatically. You went from small scale owners who were local to those businesses. And I think there's a statistic, something like 85% of all mill owners in Lancashire in the 1850s lived in Lancashire. By the 1970s, you had a huge change, and most of the textile industry had become consolidated into large industrial conglomerates. People like ICI and Courtaulds had bought up loads and loads of different manufacturing businesses and consolidated them into large, more efficient, larger manufacturing bases. But their primary concern was not the well-being of the workers and the well-being of the citizens of the towns in which those factories had been located. Their primary objective was to create the most amount of profit for the shareholders in those businesses, and those shareholders were scattered all over the world, and they were not necessarily connected to that production at all. The other really big change was second really big change was the introduction of offshoring. So those same companies at some point during this period realized that actually they could make their goods, rather than just pulling all of that production into large facilities in the UK, they could just take those large facilities and drop them into somewhere where the labor cost was a lot lower and where they could get away without doing all of the things like paying for holidays and paying for the water to be purified at the end of production and paying for the air to be cleaned and all of these things. They could just move their production somewhere where nobody really cared about all of this stuff and where the wages of workers was much lower, and they could make the stuff for less and they would make more profit. And so that's what they started to do. And so all of a sudden in this period in the 1970s onwards, you started to see made in Hong Kong labels appear in clothing in British high street stores, and it started to grow quite quickly. The other big thing that happened was the introduction of synthetic materials. So synthetic materials in their early days were introduced as a less expensive alternative to things like silk. I studied material science and engineering as an undergraduate, and I know very well that synthetic materials have lots of fantastic beneficial uses. But in the textile industry, they were mostly introduced to try and save money, or to make garments cheaper, more affordable, so that you could sell more of them, or so you could gain a competitive advantage over your competitor and still sell more of them. So it was all about selling more and making more money. It wasn't about making clothes better, because in most instances, natural materials like cotton and linen and wool are actually more pleasant to wear, and in some cases they can last longer. Linen is an incredibly durable textile with fantastic fantastic properties that mean it lasts a really long time. Wool coats and wool garments last a very long time too. I mean, cotton is not quite so durable, but it's very comfortable to wear. So synthetic materials really started to take hold, and so all of a sudden you've gone from an industry that is very distributed in its ownership, where the owners live locally, where the mills that are producing the product are using natural materials, they care about the communities in which they come from, to a completely different industry where it's driven by profit. It is using the least expensive materials and the least expensive means of production it can, and it has kind of thrown all of those employment improvements, the environmental improvements, and everything that was so hard won during the period at the end of the Industrial Revolution. They've sort of thrown all of that out the window and just moved the problem all the way to the other side of the world, where we can't see the air pollution and the river pollution and the water pollution and everything else that comes with it. And we can't see the poverty that the people that are making our clothes are being kept in. So huge changes. It also is the period of time in which fast fashion starts to become a thing. So actually, fast fashion isn't a new innovation. It's something that happened really in the 70s and 80s. And people like Topshop and Primark and Zara were all founded before the middle of the 1970s. And what happened there was that these guys came along and realized you could sell clothes for less money. You could use all of this offshore manufacturing, and you could use all these less expensive synthetic materials, and you could make clothes that are bright and fun and colorful to wear, and you can sell them cheaply. And so the fast fashion guys came in at this price, and the high street was at that price, and all of a sudden the high street started to look expensive. So they thought, how do we deal with this? We're going to have to start making our stuff cheaper. And that was the start of a period of change that has been accelerated by the online fast fashion businesses that have appeared over the last decade or so. So where the fast fashion guys were, high street was here, fast fashion was here, the new breed of online fast fashion businesses undercut those fast fashion businesses, and everybody starts to look really expensive. So everybody is now starting to try and make their clothes for less money. And of course, the way to do that is to make it in places where people get paid less, and to use less expensive, lower quality materials. And so that has been the case over the last 10 or so years. We've seen a very, very aggressive decline in the cost of clothing, which for some people might be seen as a good thing. But what it has meant is that it doesn't mean that we all spend less money on our clothes. What those people have done is very aggressively market to us and make us think that we need new stuff on a very regular basis. And as a result, actually our spending has gone up, even though the cost of clothing has come down considerably. So we now buy far, far more clothing than we ever did in the past. And most of that clothing is made in a system which is completely divorced from the communities of people that that make it. It's a completely mobile system that moves whenever the cost of labor starts to rise, or whenever another country relaxes its rules over how these businesses have to be run to give some sort of advantage. The system just moves. And what we have now is a system where textiles and clothing production are being shifted about all over the globe, chasing the cheapest dollar. Chasing the cheap needle is the term that's used these days. And we're in a situation where, as a global community, we consume extraordinary amounts of clothing. Most of the clothing we consume today is made out of synthetic materials. So about 65 to 70% of all the clothing globally is made out of polyester. Cotton is probably the next most used material. And of course, cotton can be grown in small quantities in places quite naturally without using too much irrigation and pesticides and all the rest of it. But if you want to grow cotton in the quantities that we currently, the cheap fashion industry currently requires it, you have to grow it on a very industrial scale in places where it probably doesn't grow very naturally. So it consumes huge amounts of water, huge amounts of pesticides, huge amounts of fertilizer, huge amounts of herbicides. And it causes all sorts of environmental problems. Also, the people that pick it don't get paid very much, and spend most of their time, large amounts of health problems amongst those cotton producers because of all the noxious stuff that gets sprayed onto these crops. So we've created a system where we simply consume too much clothing, and the clothing we consume does no good for anybody. It harms the planet. It doesn't help those workers enjoy a good, happy life. And to be honest, does it really make us happy to buy all this stuff when we know full well exactly how much harm is being caused by it? So looking at all of that and wondering about where the industry was going to go, because I loved fashion as a kid. I loved fashion, and and the fashion industry I think has changed so dramatically. When I was a kid, which wasn't that long, well, it was 35, 40 years ago, the fashion industry was small, and I remember saving up to buy a piece of clothing. I would save up for 6 months to buy one pair of trousers, and I would cherish those trousers and wear them until they wore out. And nowadays people buy whatever they want whenever they want, and fashion has become completely devalued. I mean, you can now buy pieces of clothing for less than the cost of a sandwich or a cup of coffee, and of course at that level, people don't value it. And it's, 80% of the clothes we buy just get thrown in the bin. We're creating enormous amounts of landfill, or in other countries, clothing is, where incineration is used, clothing is just being burned. The industry that supports it is pretty powerful. It's a pretty powerful lobby, and it makes an awful lot of money. I mean, the big fast fashion businesses make huge amounts of profit. I mean, Boohoo last year generated something like 70 odd million pounds in profit. That's a huge profit, and their business is growing very, very rapidly all the time. And so, whilst we might think that we're becoming more aware as consumers, and we might think that things like David Attenborough's Blue Planet are making us all think twice about buying synthetic clothes, and the levels of consumption, we as aware consumers, we might think that there is a general trend towards being more concerned and more conscious in the way we consume. Actually, the truth of it seems to be the complete opposite. There is an acceleration in the level of consumption in clothing right now, and we have to do something to change that. And that has to come from us as consumers. It can't, we can't rely on the brands themselves, whilst they're paying a bit of lip service to doing things better. And again, if you read the Boohoo annual report, it's full of how they're following up on the UN sustainability goals and doing things well. Truth is, the business model is one that says, sell us more stuff all the time, and that's where the problem with UK manufacturing comes in, because it is expensive to make clothes here, and it's expensive to make clothes using renewable, natural materials, and we have to try and find a way to try and resolve this giant conundrum that we're facing. And so, when I took over the Cookson and Clegg business, I looked at it, and it was clear to me that firstly, people, a growing number of people were thinking about supporting a production system that was a bit better. A growing number of consumers, a small but growing number of consumers, wanted to support businesses that were good for the planet, good for the manufacturers, good for the workers, but that all the stuff that was, but that these businesses were too expensive. And so we looked at the business model for the clothing industry, and we looked at whether or not it was possible to make some fundamental and quite radical changes to it. So if you look at where say you spend £100 at a kind of regular clothing retailer, your £100, if it's somebody like Marks and Spencers, or prior to their collapse, Debenhams and the kind of traditional retailers, if you spent 100 quid, you got about 25 quid's worth of product. And then all the rest of the money was in the kind of apparatus of consumption. And what we said was, look, well, we can't make this piece of clothing in the UK for 25 quid, but we probably can make it in the UK out of really good materials and make it in a really good way for 50 quid. So can we build a business model that gets rid of most of that cost and means we can do that and allows people to buy good clothing at an affordable price? And that's exactly what we did with community clothing. So we basically just looked at redistributing all of that economic value. So we said, look, there are consumers who care enough to want to support something that's different. And if we build a model that says, we're going to start by making it here and we're going to start by making it out of good stuff, how do we make that work? And that's exactly what we've done. So we've created a model that shifts all the economic value back down the supply chain. So the people that grow the fiber, whether that's cotton or linen or wool, they get more money. The people that make the fabric, they get more money. The people that make the clothing, they get more money. And the brand, which is us, Community Clothing, we get a lot less money. But that doesn't matter, because what we are here to do is to make this good clothing affordable and to support jobs amongst British wool farmers or British textile manufacturers or British garment manufacturers. And we want to try and keep the end price pretty much the same, but we've reshaped our whole industry, our whole business to do that. And I think the other thing that we're doing is we're encouraging people also to keep their clothes for longer, to repair their clothes, to swap them, to do all the things that I as a kid, I remember doing. We always fixed our clothes. My mum and my granny would darn stuff, and all my school uniform was secondhand. It would always come from the school uniform exchange. My sports clothes were secondhand. Everything was pretty much secondhand, and that was completely normal. And that that bit of value at the kind of post-consumption end of that chain, that has pretty much disappeared. But it's starting to come back. So we, like lots of other people, are encouraging people to keep their clothes for longer and to engage in all of those meaningful post-consumption activities. And again, that creates value. So whereas in the current system, the brand has the majority of the share of the value, what we're saying in this new model is lots and lots of other people are getting more of that share, and the brand gets a lot less. And that, of course, makes everything much fairer. It starts to lift, it lifts, most of our factories are paying at least the living wage. In fact, all of our factories are paying at least the living wage, and many are paying levels above that. And we're trying to create a model, and we think we have created a model that's actually completely sustainable. So there's a huge amount of thinking going on in this, and the kind of ultimate expression of this new way of thinking about the textile system is hyperlocal. You only wear what you can grow where you live. So if you live in the northwest of England, where I live right now, we're doing a project right now where we're growing flax and growing woad to make linen and an indigo dye. Obviously, we have sheep, so we have lamb's wool and sheep's wool that's available to us. But you only use that. You create an industry where the spinning, the weaving, the textile production, all of the distribution happens locally, and then all of this post-consumption repair cafes, swap shops, all of that stuff happens. So you create a completely different shaped industry, one where loads more value is going into the economy that you are closest to. And we're starting to get back to that previous system where all of the economic benefit from the clothing system flows into the local economy, and it creates a vibrant economy. It creates economic activity. It creates jobs. But it also massively reduces the amount of raw materials that get consumed, the amount of greenhouse gases that get created in the process of all of this, reduces the pollution, and you end up with post all of this repair and post all of this swapping, you end up with something that can be put back into the soil and is completely naturally biodegradable and disappears. And in fact, helps to regenerate the soil for the next cycle of economic production. So that is the ultimate goal. And, community clothing is working towards that goal in lots of ways. We are, we, like many people, are absolutely wedded to the idea of total traceability, of complete transparency, and of course, completely ethical production in terms of wages for workers. And, we are working towards a system that is environmentally, net carbon neutral, pollution free, and all of that. And my view is it's possible to do this. And whilst we're fighting against a large number of very well embedded businesses who don't want this to happen because their business models are based on weekly collections, Monday night drops, fortnightly newness, buy more clothes, even though they're talking about bringing in more sustainable materials and all the rest of it. Really, you cannot have a business that wants you to buy more stuff every week that calls itself sustainable, because as we all know, really the best way to, and the only way to make clothing more sustainable is to get to a point where we consume a lot less of it, and everything we consume is made in a way that has, no negative effect on the environment. So that's the kind of ultimate goal. I feel like I've talked an awful lot. The other thing that's great about all this is that, it creates an industry that actually young people can feel connected to and can feel proud of. So, we do have a problem in this country because the textile industry and garment making feels kind of old-fashioned. But if we can create an industry that feels completely vibrant and modern and new and is working towards genuine environmental neutrality and in fact possibly better than that, and working towards creating fantastic conditions for everyone that works in those industries, then I think we will start to see people want to come and work in these industries. And again, for towns like Blackburn, where we're based, and lots of other towns like Blackburn in the textile region, so whether that's in Lancashire or Yorkshire or southern Scotland, or the East Midlands, these are areas that desperately need good jobs, and they desperately need a sense of purpose for young people that are living there. We want to give young people a reason to stay in these places and to help them carve out meaningful careers for themselves in these places. So that's the ultimate aim. Right, I see Joan is back. Do we have a question?
Yes, well, I was sitting in the background. Thank you very much, Patrick. That was great. Covered an awful lot of material there. I guess one of the areas, obviously just following up from what you were talking about with sustainability, and the thread through this is about buying better, buying less. How do you think we can help educate the consumer to think that way? Because we're up against the marketing of, buy more, all of that. Obviously, I followed community clothing from their crowdfunding launch, bought into the jeans, have still got them, still wearing them. So, I understand and have followed what you've been doing with that, which is great. But how do we get the consumer to think this way?
Well, I think it boils down to our ability as creatives to tell good stories. We had a good idea. It's two things. Firstly, have a good idea and make sure it's meaningful and real. Community clothing is not, a lot of businesses now are looking for ways to try and create a veneer of sustainable, ethical behavior over a business model which is anything but sustainable and ethical. And community clothing was built from its very foundations on the idea of creating really good quality employment for people by making really good quality stuff out of natural, renewable things. So we didn't have to fake, the story, but we did have to do a good job of telling the story and continuing to tell the story. And, we are helped in that by the fact that the story of our business is the story of real people in towns that our customers care about. And so our job is to continue to make good clothes and to continue to tell the story in a way that it engages with the consumer and makes the consumer want to choose us over the less good alternative. And we work very hard to do that. And I think one of the things that many of the creatives working in the north of Scotland have is an abundance of natural assets that many consumers would consider to be really compelling. We've just come through a period of 18 months where we've all been stuck in our homes pretty much. We're on the back of years and years of a drive towards a much more digital existence than we've ever had before. And as human beings, we kind of relish the contact with real craft and real activities and beautiful places and and wilderness and wildness and solitude and peace and quiet and beautiful natural places. And all of these things are fantastic assets for creatives who are working in those places to create compelling narratives with the customer. You're up against it. The existing competition are have won the position they have by being really good at marketing, mostly. I mean, they are solid and powerful, and they have huge teams of people whose only job it is to try and sell you more of their stuff. And because they've got lots of money, they have a very big share of voice. They have a big share of voice amongst the traditional print media. They have a big share of voice in the newer version of the digital version of the traditional print media. They can pay lots and lots and lots of influencers to sell you their product. But what they don't have in great spades is authenticity and a unique voice. And much of what you see in the content from most of those big brands is something that sounds like a sort of washed down, diluted version of the really cool stories that you hear from smaller brands and more inspiring creatives. And I think that is the thing that the small business has to their advantage, is this unique voice. And most, my business, it's my voice that carries most of our messaging. And as I said, because our business is founded on this very specific social outcome and environmental outcome, it's easy to find those stories because they just bubble up every day. And for those of us that are trying to start a business and get it off the ground, those compelling stories are incredibly valuable.
Yeah, great. I think one of the things there is obviously the power of making as well, and obviously the impact of the Great British Sewing Bee and the pandemic, people being at home and having time on their hands. That must have helped the whole sort of focus on making and as well. Interestingly, WGSN sees very much in their trend prediction that they did yesterday, they talked about the resourcefulness and the artisan of craft. How are you seeing that come through? People making more, wanting to make more from home? Are they starting to do that?
I mean, I feel that more people are making things at home, but I think more importantly, people want to feel connected to brands that are doing this. Whether you go out and learn how to whittle a spoon doesn't mean that you don't want to be connected to people who are whittling spoons, or making beautiful knives by hand, or handcrafting saddles, or making bits of beautiful bespoke luggage, or whatever it happens to be, knitting wonderful things. We as human beings, I think we like doing this stuff ourselves, but it takes a fair amount of time to become skilled in doing that. And I think the next best thing is to connect ourselves with people who are doing these things in the right way. And I think we quite naturally, I think, tend to want to support those businesses that are that are connected with craft, because we like being connected with human beings, and we like being connected with things where we can see the fundamental value in the product, because we understand the connection between brain and hand and product. I think in craft products, there is quite a direct connection, and we can feel and understand that value. And again, it makes us feel good as consumers to be supporting those people that are doing things that we feel we would maybe like to be doing ourselves.
Yeah. Supporting more, and obviously there has been a big growth in supporting local, and also seeing more platforms coming online that represent individual makers as well, which is great. Just for the audience, really to say, we've got 5 minutes left or so. If you've got any questions, just pop them in the Q&A box or the chat box, and we can ask Patrick. There is one that came in, and I'm not sure how much you've covered of this, but it's to say, I'm really excited to hear about your homegrown Homespun project. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. Well, Homegrown Homespun is a project that's being run by Community Clothing along with the British Textile Biennial, which is an arts-based biennial that engages people in the former textile communities along the Leeds-Liverpool Canal with arts and cultural activities, arts, craft and cultural activities. It also is the third partner is Northwest England Fibershed. Fibershed are an organisation that are promoting this idea of hyperlocalism in clothing. The idea of homegrown homespun is really simple. We want to make, as I mentioned before, we want to make clothes out of the stuff that we can grow. So we're growing flax in a piece of land in the middle of Blackburn that was a bit of derelict land next to the Leeds-Liverpool Canal. Flax is an amazing plant. It grows completely naturally. It used to grow all across the UK. We used to, before we started importing cotton, flax and linen were the staples of everybody's wardrobes, not just our wardrobes, but what we slept in and what we made our sails from and all sorts of stuff. So linen is an incredibly resilient little plant. You throw it in the ground, and 100 days later, you have something a metre tall that you can turn into fibre by various quite nice natural processes. You just lay it on the ground and you let the dew and the change in temperature overnight rot the outside of this plant, and then you break it and tease out the fibre from within it, and then you can spin that fibre into different qualities of yarn. And you get a linen textile that is incredibly incredibly environmentally friendly. So this is our goal, is to see if we can. Well, firstly, we're just going to make some on quite a small scale, but the bigger goal is to see whether the conditions exist now to allow the regeneration of a commercial scale version of this project. Something that looks a bit like the Harris tweed industry, where you have locally produced wool, you have spinners, dyers, weavers, and some products and garment manufacturers, all within this local ecosystem, economic ecosystem. Supporting a few hundred jobs on the Isle of Harris, and it seems to me that it should be possible to do something similar with flax and linen locally in Lancashire. But there are bits missing. So we have weavers. We know that we can grow it, but we don't have linen processing plants anymore. The last one of those closed in the mid-90s, and we don't have any linen spinners either. But can modern technology may mean that we can create small-scale plants that do those bits, that allow that whole ecosystem to come together? Because at the moment, you'd have to process it in Northern Europe, in Belgium or in Holland. You'd have to spin it in Europe. But it could all be done here. And would that, would the end product be, could we turn that into a piece of clothing that would be saleable at a price that most people can afford to buy it? And would they want to buy it if they could afford it? And what benefit would all of that have? And who might stump up the chunk of money that's needed to kickstart this process? Because if it created 300 jobs, what would that be worth to the local economy. And so the whole project is around about trying to establish whether this system is feasible in this area. And also there's loads of other side benefits. We've engaged lots of schools in the project. So we've got school kids now, looking at the comparisons between the current fast fashion system that they mostly support and this new system. They're adopting bits of the woodland around the field and doing environmental audits and measuring the trees and working how much carbon gets sequestered. But we're also studying things like the soil benefits, the carbon sequestration, all of the environmental and social benefits of running a sort of green textile system local to Blackburn, which obviously was a town that had a huge economic interest in textiles. It was a textile town for a couple of hundred years. And can we reconnect citizens with a new, greener textile system, and what benefits will that have for people's mental and physical health? How many, other new green biotech industries might be spawned out of ideas around this whole thing? So it's a really interesting project. It's the first product will be hopefully ready for the textile biennial, which is in October of this year. But the big goal is for the next biennial, which is in 2023, to see if we can create a meaningful and sustainable commercial scale system around the product. But even if we can't, there will be loads and loads of benefit to the local community, and loads of educational benefit that will come from this.
Great, Patrick. I know we're very, very short of time. Just a couple of questions, of course, come in towards the end here. One's about encouraging young people into manufacturing.
Well, again, I think the big challenge there is we have to make manufacturing feel kind of sexier and cooler. I get to go and see some amazing factories, and I know that they're great places to work. I mean, I know that the young people that come and start working at Cookson and Clegg love it. It doesn't matter what background you come from. You all of a sudden you become part of an ecosystem that is incredibly productive and focused and provides a sense of purpose to your life. And you gain a new family. The team of people around you become your friends, your mentors. I've seen how great manufacturing businesses are as places to change the lives of young people. And I think successive governments have done a very poor job of selling manufacturing careers, partly because I think they don't believe that they have a good future. I think they're very good at encouraging the manufacture of technologically advanced products, but they're not very good at promoting the technologically advanced manufacture of more traditional products. And anything we make today, we have to make in a super efficient, incredibly modern way. So it doesn't matter whether it's the most basic item or the most complicated. The manufacture of that item can be incredibly high tech and needs to be incredibly high tech to be efficient and competitive. And I think that's the thing. I think the textile industry and the garment industry has been underinvested in for quite a long time. But I think with the right investment and with the right long-term outcome, I think there can be places that young people are desperate to go and work in. I'd like to think that young people growing up in Blackburn would be desperate to come and work at one of the community clothing partner factories, knowing that it's modern, it's advanced, it's green, it's sustainable, it's doing all sorts of great things. But I think we've got a lot of work to do to promote the idea of these careers to young people.
Definitely, that needs to start in schools, and that conversation starting early, so it's not a "you'll end up in a factory" type comment, which has been used a lot in the past.
If you're lucky, you will get to have a fantastic career in manufacturing. Not if you're a bad lad, you'll end up, down the factory. I mean, it's all about changing that idea. Yeah.
Sorry, we've literally only got 3 minutes left before we get booted out, unfortunately. One last comment is actually not all factories in the UK are equal and equally good, and we've seen some bad cases, particularly in Leicestershire. Yeah. The question is, which would in turn help reposition the reputation and perceived value of apparel? What can we do about that within the UK? And obviously that probably is government as well as pressure from the consumer.
Yeah, I think it is. It's both of those things. I mean, there has been a long history of turning a blind eye to bad factories in places that really need the employment. You can, to a certain extent, understand the reluctance to tackle it head on in places where, money is incredibly scarce, but it has to happen. And consumers need to vote with their feet and their wallets. They need to stop supporting anything where it isn't absolutely guaranteed that the conditions people work in and under are not exemplary. But yeah, I think it will. I think there's been so much negative press over some of those factories, and I've seen some of those places, and they're not good. And any brand that says that they're auditing things, and so they just we just need to stop supporting those businesses that do that stuff.
So lastly, it's to do with the rise of veganism. I must admit myself, I've worked in an Irish linen. I remember the smell of the linen looms and the dampness, which was wonderful. And of course, that doesn't exist very much now. But it's actually, how do we encourage people to move away from synthetic fibres to natural fibres? And obviously not all natural fibres are equal. We've got fantastic wool in this country, and it's undervalued as well. So yeah, really about the anti-synthetic fibres, and we've really only 1 minute.
I mean, it is, again, it's about education. I mean, I think you read the annual reports of some of these big fast fashion companies. They're talking about, we're moving to recycled polyester, as if that is a solution. I mean, we recycled polyester uses way more energy than virgin polyester, and you still have polyester at the end of it. And if that whole system is not closed loop, you're still creating a load of polyester waste. You're just starting with a drinks bottle and then ending up with polyester waste in textiles, and you're using more energy to get there. I mean, in theory, it is it's a more renewable source, but none of it's closed loop. It's all still linear. I mean, again, people just need to be clear that recycled synthetics are not a solution to this problem. They might be slightly better in some senses, but they're also worse in others. And if we really care about the huge problem with the amount of plastic pollution in our air and in our water systems, we just have to stop using this stuff. And it might be that we have to wear clothes that aren't quite as comfortable to wear for sport as the stuff that we've got used to. But I grew up playing rugby in cotton shorts, cotton jersey, and woolen socks. And I didn't think, Jesus, I can't play rugby in this stuff. That was just what we wore. We're now used to wearing synthetics, but we just have to change. We just have to say, you know what? It's not going to dry as quickly, and it's going to feel a little bit heavier when it gets wet. But you know what? That's how it is, because I choose to look after the planet first, and my own slight amount of minor discomfort is going to have to just come a second place.
Great, thank you. And I'm afraid I'm going to have to draw this to an end because we're just over time. So on behalf of XpoNorth and the audience, Patrick, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your knowledge and your passion for UK making as well. So all the best, and thank you very much. Lots of great commentary coming in. Fab session, thank you. Thank you from the range of people here. So yes, on that note, we're going to get cut off. So thank you very much. And
thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.